Welcome everybody to Key Concept 7.1, Understanding Wellbeing. Let's focus first then on what we mean by the term wellbeing. The concept is broadly captures our hopes for children and young people, particularly important, of course, in this time of social, political and financial uncertainty. When anyone asks a parent what they want for their child from their education, they will often say, most of all, I want them to be happy. So that's that sense of capturing our hopes for them. We've been talking about this for a very long time, though. People as far back as the early philosopher Aristotle have been trying to understand well-being and what constitutes a good life. Schools and education systems have increasingly been seen as the logical sites, well, aside from family, for supporting children's well-being. This means we've needed to find ways to try and measure as well as define well-being. Let's focus now on how students define well-being. In a recent large-scale study that we undertook here at Southern Cross University, we asked over 700 students in primary and secondary schools across New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland what well-being means to them. They identified the term well-being as both familiar and a bit strange. They had heard the word used many times before, in particular at school, but they found it difficult to actually define it. So they said things like, well, it's how you, I know what I'm thinking, but I don't know how to explain it. Or often they'd say to us, oh, that's actually a really hard question. Students also discussed the ambiguous nature of well-being. They talked about the fact that sometimes you can be simultaneously sad and happy, but that you could still have well-being. So it was really good in that study to see the ways in which students wrestle with the term well-being and how they understand it. Out of the same study, we were able to identify 3 domains of well-being that students describe. Broadly, these were about being, having, and doing. The being domain was very much about things like being socially and emotionally well, for example, being happy, being healthy, having a spiritual dimension to your life, and being comfortable with that. In terms of having, emphasis was very much on things like having voice, having a sense of equality, confidence, respect, support from significant others, having privacy and having rights at school were really important in terms of well-being. In terms of doing, the kinds of things that students talked about were looking after yourself, having self-acceptance, making good decisions, and acts of generosity and kindness. And students generally saw these as contributing to their well-being. It's probably important to note, though, that all of these 3 domains emphasise the agency and the capability of the child or the young person. And that's really important, that young people engage with the idea of well-being not as a passive experience, but as something active. And if we look at what teachers said about well-being, we spoke to teachers as well as to students in that study, 89 I think all up. They said, well-being is multidimensional. We'll come back to that in a moment. It's dependent on relationships. Talk more about that too. Well-being is embedded in culture. It's the way we do things around here. It's exemplified in programs of pastoral care, particularly in secondary schools, and in the ways we approach pastoral care more broadly in schools. Teachers also said well-being is dependent on student well-being is dependent on teacher well-being. How well students do is often a bit dependent on how well teachers are doing. It's impacted on or shaped by pedagogy, by the way we approach teaching and learning, supplemented by wellbeing programs supported by counsellors, and enhanced by parent partnership. Importantly, teachers said that well-being in schools is really dependent on, the way it's approached is really dependent on leadership, but that it is situated in a rather confused policy environment where different terms are used to describe well-being. So there's been quite a lot of models that try to exemplify that multidimensional aspect of well-being that we've talked about. Students rightly identified, as did the teachers, well-being is difficult to define, but it is generally understood as being very dynamic in nature. And these couple of models, if you like, of well-being that you can see on the screen now are just some examples of the way that that multidimensional aspect of well-being is exemplified. Important to note there what Dodge said, that well-being is the balance point between an individual's resource pool and the challenges faced. That is, can students adapt to adversity when they need to? Do they have the resources to do that? Well-being is also linked to the development of social and emotional skills. These include things like the ability to identify and understand one's feelings, to accurately read and comprehend emotional states in others, like empathy, manage strong emotions and their expression, regulate one's behaviour, develop empathy, and establish and sustain relationships. The teaching of these kinds of skills is now quite commonplace in education settings. It's important to note, though, that students in a recent study that we've undertaken highlighted the importance of experiencing well-being at school, not just learning about it, and that's really important. Well-being, though, as a term, is also often conflated with mental health and resilience. Mental health means much more than the absence of mental illness. The two shouldn't be confused, and it's critical to children and young people's well-being. It's variously defined, but mental health generally is understood to incorporate the capacity to cope with and adapt well to adversity. And that links very seamlessly with the notion of resilience. Quote there reminds us of this: sustaining well-being depends upon an individual's capacity and the resources they can draw upon, some of which they get from school, to help them maintain their balance point repeatedly and over time. So back to well-being at school, and specifically in the school context. Schools have become increasingly concerned about student well-being and the most effective ways of addressing that. There is considerable literature on teacher well-being, and this has increased as demands on teachers and the education profession more broadly have increased. There are two key aspects to well-being that we need to think about, whether we're talking now about teacher well-being or about student well-being. One concerns the environmental and the cultural conditions of schools. That suggests that if we don't give attention to the cultural conditions that support student well-being at school, that is their holistic wellness, their flourishing and thriving right here, right now, then students' well-being will be inhibited. So the culture needs to provide and support the conditions for children to thrive. So we need you to think about what that might mean. The other aspect beyond the environmental or the cultural is about the educative. And it's where as we've previously said, supporting students to develop the social and emotional skills to maintain that balance point both now and in the future. So that's really linking back into those social and emotional skills that we've just spoken about. I just wanted to point out now a very recent initiative of the federal government, which was launched in late 2018, called the Australian Student Wellbeing Framework. So to date, we haven't had a national framework for understanding and supporting student wellbeing at school. So this national framework is quite significant because previously we've left it up to the states to define or to scope what that might look like. The vision behind having this framework is that Australian schools are learning communities that promote student wellbeing, safety and positive relationships. So that vision is really important in an environment that very often is promoting the importance of academic excellence. This framework is suggesting that well-being as an integral part of that. The framework supports principals, school leaders, teachers and students and their families to build a respectful and inclusive learning environment where all students can reach their potential. You'll see on that diagram that there are 5 interconnected elements, and these are leadership, inclusion, student voice, partnerships, and support. These are what provide the foundation for enhanced student wellbeing and learning outcomes. We've provided the URL there for you to go in and have a little look at that framework because it's really helpful for your learning around this topic. Putting leadership to the side for the moment though, because that's aimed more at principals and school leaders, let's look at what the other 4 elements have to say. I'll just leave that up there for a moment for you to look at. And I'll leave the last word about the concept of well-being and its link to happiness to a quite well-known legend, John Lennon, who says, "When I was 5 years old, my mother always told me that happiness was the key to life. When I went to school, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wrote down happy. They told me I didn't understand the assignment, and I told them they didn't understand life."